So good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining the Costing and Financing for Scale webinar organized by the Education Working Group for the Scaling Up Community of Practice. My name is Gail Simon. I am the Practice Area Leader for Education at MSI and co-chair for this working group. I will be moderating today's session with my co-chair Heather Simpson, who's Chief Program Officer at Room to Read. Before we get started with our presentations, I would like to invite you all to download the Scaling Principles and Lessons Guide available on the Scaling Up Community of Practice website. You can scan the QR code that you are seeing on the slide right now on your screen, and it'll take you directly to that document. Our webinar today will address Principle 4, which focuses on identifying systemic opportunities, constraints, and risk to scaling up. The guidance points to the need to pay heed to three aspects of the context or the system in which planning for scale takes place. Number one is systemic constraints and opportunities in general. Second is financial constraints in particular, and which we will be discussing today. And third, systemic risk. The guide notes that one of the principal reasons that scaling efforts fail is that the financial resources required to cover the cost of scaling and of sustained implementation at large scale are missing or inadequate. It further states that a viable long-term business or funding model that aligns resources with cost is critical. In the education sector, we know very well that data points to chronic underfunding of public education systems. And Principle 4 notes that many publicly provided goods and services cannot generate sufficient revenue or cannot do so in a manner that incorporates the needs of marginalized groups, which includes girls, children with disabilities, and children from linguistic and ethnic minority groups who are often excluded from education systems. And so today, we are very fortunate to have two wonderful presentations. First, we will hear from Chantale Kallas, the Scaling and Partnership Lead at IRC's MENA Regional Office. Chantale will discuss how her team is addressing costing and financing for the Scaling Ahlan Simsim and Early Childhood Development Program in Iraq, Jordan, and Syria. Then we will hear from Joseph DeStefano, the Senior Director of Policy Systems and Governance in International Education at RTI. Joe will discuss issues related to accurately estimating the cost of scaling up an education intervention introduced through a development partners funded project. Each presentation will last about 15 minutes, and we will have 15 minutes at the end for questions. Please remember to use the Q&A function at the top of your window to ask questions of our presenters. Chantale, I will now pass this on to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. I hope you can also see my screen. So as introduced, I am currently the partnership and scaling lead for a project that is conducted in the Middle East called the Ahlan Simsim project. Before I deep dive into financing, let me just introduce you quickly to the project we're working on. So Ahlan Simsim is a project that started in 2018, and I'd like to call it more of a program than a project per se. Bless you. That we work, in which we work towards innovative and creative ways to introduce and push the ECD agenda, the Early Childhood Development Agenda overall in the region, covering, as said, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. What we want to see is by the end of this program, a change in the whole spectrum or the whole sector to include the components of the early childhood development in education, definitely, but also in health and social development and in all aspects of the work. We have adopted the definition for scaling. I know there's several definitions that have been discussed. One of them is scaling a model. For us, we have been partnering with the Center for Universal Education. We adopted the definition that talks about expanding, deepening, and sustaining impact. For us, as Ahlan Simsim, we went deep dive into these three terms. So far, this is where we are. We see that expanding is to reach the greatest number of individuals or children, younger children and their families in that matter, uh, who this organization or the partner organization that we work with can reach, from the government, national, to also subnational authorities, to also NGOs and CBOs in some cases. And when we say deepening, and that's rooted in Principle 4 that was just introduced to us again, is working in systems. So from the beginning, we try to understand the system and the context we work in details, from its creation to its finances to all of the details that are related to it. And then we go to sustainability. And this is why we start discussing finances and costing for scale from day one, from the design meeting we have with our partners, so that we can plan accordingly. To move you forward into our journey, it's not a straightforward journey. So we have been designing with some partners, piloting with others, expanding with others, and scaling up in some cases, scaling down in other cases. As I said, we work in 4 countries, and we have new pathways that are now to be added to the Iraq work, where we have worked with the Ministries of Education across the 4 countries, specifically in Northeast, Northwest Syria, to work on improvement of early childhood education. We've worked with the Ministry of Health in Jordan, and we've worked with the Ministry of Health in Jordan and Lebanon for different initiatives, of which one in primary healthcare center, the other in nurseries. We've also been targeting and working closely with different entities and ministries for daycares and to reach children that are between 0 and 3. I wanted to give you the snapshot of our journey so that we can deep dive into our thinking of costing. And because we are really keen on, and we say that succeeding in scaling is being able to achieve on 3 levels: quality, sustainability, and reach. And when I say succeeding in scaling, it's not about the project succeeding in scaling, it's about us and the partner that has been leading on this work within the national system, being able to take this work forward and being able to track the quality of the work. Take it forward, sustainability, track quality, and also reaching the biggest number of children. The first enemy we found when we started to talk about financing is that we speak different languages. Even within our team, we started thinking, is it a cost model? Is it cost efficiency? Is it cost effectiveness? And then we're like, how about we look at all of this? As I started, we're not kind of scaling a model. We do have models. We have models that target children. We have models that target parents. But with our key partners, rather than focusing on scaling a model, we try to understand what is the main problem they are facing and how can we use the resources in this program to work on this problem. And this is why we're doing cost models, and we're trying as much as possible to see what is the cost of models we have developed for IRC or similar INGOs, and what would be the cost for a local actor. Why are we doing that? Because some partners want to take the models as is, and it's a choice that we are not against as well. But also what we're focusing on is understanding cost efficiency, analyzing the cost that it took us to also start this program, work with the partner, build something, and then the cost at long term. So we want to understand this cost, and we want to couple it with all of the data that comes in from the program, from the partner, to really understand cost efficiency. On another level, we're also doing impact studies that would also combine with the program or with the initiatives or the intervention that are being scaled to feed into the conversation on cost effectiveness. All of this is being done across the different pathways, and learnings have been developed throughout. What we have adopted, as we found that we work in very different contexts. we as the IRC are definitely working in one region for now for the Ahlan Simsim project, and specifically in 4 countries. But you can't imagine how different these countries are from each other and what exists in the context of every country that enable us to work. Let me take you through some of our examples. So in Jordan, what we found is that we started with a small readiness program that reached 7,000 children. Then with the ministry, we said, why don't we expand it to reach more children through a remedial program they have for 3 years, reaching 250,000 children with holistic learning from numeracy literacy to social emotional learning. But that is not sustainable and scalable. The approach moving forward is to integrate components on social emotional learning and learning through play into the existing continuous professional development of teachers. But this is paid for, right? So this is where we're lucky sometimes by understanding and analyzing the system well and knowing what exists in that system. There's no additional cost when this goes to scale. And this is one example of many that whereby the ministry we're working with or the main partner that is leading on this scaling initiative will be able to take this work forward with no additional cost. And this is, to be honest, our preferred way of doing the work moving forward, because it allows us and the partner to continue this work without kind of worrying about the financials and the cost that might be associated with it in the future. On the other side, when you're working in contexts like Lebanon, where there's a big financial crisis in the country and the costs of everything is now, or the budget, the national budget for everything is now almost at risk. It's a question of how do we work on advocacy. So we're working on advocacy now with the ministry itself by costing, like in Lebanon specifically, we're doing standards and a program that would be integrated. We're doing, not us as IRC, with the Ministry of Public Health, standards and programs that would be integrated in nurseries across Lebanon. So to be able to do that and continue in working towards that, there is a cost associated with it, but that's also a private sector. So we need to do advocacy along the private sector to put some funds, advocacy along the donors to support intermediary, and advocacy along the parliament and government to really have an ECD line in the national budget in Lebanon, which is something that never have happened before. So as we're working towards an intervention per se, what we want to do is to make sure that early childhood development is taken into consideration in the national budget. And the advocacies to move that forward is not about advocacy with a certain entity, but across different entities in this system that are allowing this work to be possible. And as I said at the beginning, this is not very possible if we don't do now, and we're doing as we're going a proper analysis of the financing for the different phases of scaling we're working towards. Comes Northwest Syria, where we're working with a network of NGOs. So in Northwest Syria, for those of you who have been working there, the main players in providing services in this part of Syria are big local NGOs that usually are either protection, health, or education, but none of them is early childhood development specialist. And if we're talking early childhood development, for us, education is part of it, but not all of it. So we want to make sure it's comprehensive and inclusive of all. So what we have been working on is we have been working with these local NGOs, and we've built together a network that has been launched last week. It's called the ECD Network of Northwest Syria. And this network's main work or main goal is to advocate and lobby to ensure financing and prioritization of early childhood development on a national level. In this case, we're talking more about donor than we're talking about specifically government or national budget per se, but we're talking about influential donors and UN agencies that would help and support in moving this work forward. So this is how we're seeing, and as you can see, there's no one size fits all. And I always say, because we have the opportunity to work across the different contexts and in every context across different ministries, we can't compare them because it's as if we're comparing oranges to apples. So we have to make sure we tailor for everyone. And back to my my second or third slide, I think, where I said at the beginning, we started fighting what makes sense, right, for us as a project. But for us as a project, everything makes sense. And as long as we are moving forward with every scaling initiative from within the system, from within the context, we're building towards something that could be successful, that can fit into this context and this work's theme. Moving forward, we have a lot of questions. I was hoping we'd bring to you a lot of answers, but for us, there's a lot of questions and a lot of things that we want to explore further as we build our scaling work, as we move forward. Our project has 1.5 years to continue, and these are very critical 1.5 years, where we look at these learning, we make sure these learning are translated into actionable things that we can try and we can tell more about. But I'd like to hear from all of you as well today about your experiences in this, your experiences working towards scaling and financing, and share more about our experience as Ahlan Simsim. I have a lot to say, but I wanted to have a smaller presentation and more time for Q&As. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chantale. I just wanted to give folks a chance for just a moment if there are any clarifying questions for Chantale. After Joe does his presentation, we'll have more time for questions that go across both. So just want to take a moment to see if there are any clarifying questions for Chantale right now.
I think there's a question from Christine.
Let's see. Okay, thank you. Let's see. In contexts where education systems have so many needs, how did IRC prioritize which component or components to prioritize with their government counterparts?
Definitely, that's a very good question, Christine. And we need to prioritize because we need to start somewhere. And this is where, when I said we start with a design meeting, that was very keen for us. And by design meetings, we meant sometimes design days, where we really think with the partners. But before we go into the design, we do a proper context analysis, either by doing or system understanding, if you want, in a way. So either by doing starting by a desk review, using different tools, understanding the main gap, and then going to that partner and with them offering this information and thinking together what is the main problem that is facing, in the case we're saying education, early childhood education now in this country. We focus on early childhood. We focus on 5 to 8 when it comes to school, the education, but definitely there's more about this, but our focus is that specific age range. And with COVID, we had to shift, look for windows of opportunity, support as we go, and we built for short time and longer time interventions as well.
Thank you. Any other clarifying question right now? All right. Gael, over to you to introduce Joe.
Yes, no, thank you so much. Joseph DeStefano, you can come on camera. We are looking forward to your presentation. Oh, you are on mute.
Thanks. Let me get my screen up and running here.
Right.
Wait a sec. Okay, this is going to be share. This screen. Are you seeing my presentation or are you seeing the Zoom meetings?
No, we're seeing your presentation. That's great.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where on the planet you are. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to share quickly, sort of a quick overview of some of the work we've been doing, looking at large-scale programs that have had success in improving learning outcomes. And there's a few points I want to make about some lessons we've learned from looking at the costs associated with those programs. We're still in the midst of finalizing this study, and so we're continuing to work on how to really understand the costs in an effective way, and how to share that information going forward so that we can improve education systems and help them address some of the costing issues that Chantale was just speaking to, and which I'll speak to as well. So without that, let me give a quick overview of my presentation. So this is all based on a Gates Foundation funded Learning at Scale study, which maybe some of you are familiar with. And that study looked at 8 programs that we were able to identify that had achieved success in terms of improving learning outcomes in an appreciable way, and doing so at scale. What the scale at which that was done varied considerably from country to country. But the idea was to identify the factors that contribute to success at scale. And I will put in the chat later a link to a blog by Jonathan Stern that summarizes some of the findings from that study. But I want to focus on the cost analysis aspect of this, which is work we've been doing in conjunction with Christine Harris Van Kuren from SALT Analytics, who's been invaluable in terms of her diligence in trying to gather cost data and analyze them and understand what it implies for how we understand the costs of going to scale. So some of the points I'll be addressing, so getting to true cost of an intervention is not easy. I think Christine is on the call and she can certainly speak to that. Comparing costs of externally funded programs is complicated, as you would expect, by the contextual factors. It costs a very different amount of money to implement something, say, in Malawi versus in Central Asia or in Southeast Asia. But beyond that, there's really the issue of how the external funding drives program design, which can be a distorting factor in terms of what the costs end up being. So as I think Chantale made this point, so I'll show some of this as well in detail. The costs of scale up is separate from the additional recurring costs that are needed to sort of keep the system going, as well as, that infusion of resources that gets you away from business as usual. So those 2 final points I'll make to conclude the presentation. So let me talk about the variation in costs across programs. So what we see is that total funding, and this is in millions of US dollars, varies a lot from one program to another. And you might expect that, given, a program in a large country will cost more than a program in a small country. And so when you look at the costs of the program compared to the scale in the simple terms of the number of students reached by the program, there's less of a relationship than one would have anticipated. And I think it's an interesting question to pose why that ends up being so. And some of the program design is related to the number of schools to be reached, or the number of schools, say, in one state in India or in several states in India would be far more than the number of states in a small sub-Saharan African country like Senegal. But that's not the only thing that's driving this, because the other factor is the amount of funding that a development agency has allocated for operations in that country. And that often a program gets designed based on the total level of funding that's available. And so it's not necessarily the most cost-efficient design from the get-go, because it's based in part on the amount of available funding. So that's something I'd like us to come back to in the discussion when we think about how we truly understand what it costs to improve education. So what that means is that that previous slide means that there ends up being huge variations in unit costs when you look across programs, from as low as less than $3 to more than $50 per student. And so it challenges us to think critically about how to get inside that sort of rough unit cost calculation and truly understand what costs are required and what investments are required to actually impact classrooms. So the distortion that derives from the level of funding that's available ends up perhaps preventing us from really understanding what's going on beneath that and what are the investments that are most critical. But let's take a look inside some of the unit costs. So if we look at that $4.04 unit cost breakdown from one of the programs, we look at how it's composed of the critical inputs in the case of trying to improve, say, early grade reading. This is how the unit costs break down. So the 63% spent on teacher training, 25% on materials, 9% on grants to sort of support disadvantaged schools, and then 4% on ongoing teacher support. So in this particular program, we can understand the composition of the ingredients, if you will, that were part of the investment made that led to the improved outcomes that this one program was able to achieve. And if we look at that in total over an annual average project spend, we see, the millions of dollars that are needed, primarily in this case for teacher training, but also for materials, grants, and teacher support. And you can come back and think about this in terms of what aspects of this are an initial investment, and then what aspects of this need to recur into the future as the system tries to sustain the improvements that the program contributed to. But what's interesting is the composition of the unit costs across all 8 programs varies considerably. So for teacher training, some programs invested as much as 92% of what they were doing on teacher training, some as little as 17%. For teacher support, which is the ongoing visiting of school and supporting teachers as they apply the training they receive, we see a variation from as little as 2% to as high as 38%. And for materials, similarly, a very low end, some programs to a very high end in others. And it's worth trying to understand why this is the case. And when we're trying to understand how one set of investments in one country led to improvements compared to another set of investments in another country, understanding what drives one program investing more on teacher training, another investing more on materials, I think is really a critical set of questions to ask ourselves if we're going to try and learn from looking across programs and not just in analyzing the investments needed in one particular country. So the last point I want to make is this issue about costs are not constant and some don't recur. So during the first years of an externally supported project to try and move the system from the status quo ante to an improved level of performance, there's a significant infusion of resources that's needed. And that's a project by definition. But I think it's, we have to recognize that if there is a learning crisis, as we all are repeatedly saying these days, and the data are telling us that there is, then improvement is going to require an infusion of resources. But what we can sort of look at and see is how does that change over time, and that initial infusion is not necessarily what needs to be carried out. So if there's 2 years of teacher training that are needed to get teachers to adopt a new instructional approach that dramatically improves the results they're able to obtain with their students, you don't have to keep doing that every single year. But other inputs are required to continue. If we think the ongoing teacher support is an important element of what keeps teachers improving their practice and paying attention to whether or not their students are actually learning and doing things like differentiating instruction and helping learners who fall behind, then those kinds of resources are needed to continue, as well as materials need to be replaced, updated on an ongoing basis. And so, you know, we could look out over time and think about how beyond the life of the project, there's this sort of ongoing need for investment for those kinds of things that do need to be continued. And so the important question is this continuation of this investment beyond that initial infusion that sort of moves the system off its previous level of performance. What this represents in terms of an additional amount of spending compared to what the system was spending before. And the real challenge is that most education systems in the world are already spending a significant amount of resources. You know, in most lower middle and middle income countries, education is the largest, you know, non-debt, non-defense part of the government budget. In some countries, they're already putting in 5, 6, 7% of GDP to education. So to think about where those additional resources are going to come from, or how current allocations of resources need to be changed in order to continue the investments required to sustain improvements. And the real challenge is estimating what that additional amount of continued funding is going to be, and then helping governments and the development partners have a realistic appreciation for the amount of time it's going to take for governments to be able to make those allocations or make those changes in allocations. And especially now, given the way the world economy has been impacted by the pandemic and the repercussions of the war in Europe, expecting education systems to suddenly find new pots of money, I think we have to be realistic about what we can expect there, and accept that continued external assistance is probably going to be required in a lot of countries in order to maintain any improvements in education that initial investments are able to achieve. So with that, I'll end and leave some time for discussion. Look forward to your questions and comments and a useful exchange around these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And I want to open it up for any clarifying questions first for Joe, and then we'll open it up for questions across both of these presentations.
And did I stop sharing?
I am still seeing myself.
You're still
I think I just stopped sharing.
Yeah, that looks good. Let's see. Richard has a question. I think it's already striking that unit costs were a range from $4 to $50. One often sees no attention to unit costs or unit costs that are in the hundreds or thousands. These are relatively low costs. These relatively low costs were a deliberate choice to keep within existing budget realities. I get that's the question. Were these deliberately tagged to that level?
So the point I was trying to make, Richard, thanks for your question, is that in some cases, in part, yes, that the design of the program is looking to have as efficient an approach as possible. By example, searching for economies of scale in terms of production and printing and distribution of materials, or trying to take lower cost approaches to providing teacher training. But in other cases, it's really just a function of this is the pot of money that, say, USAID has available for country X, and so that's how much the project is going to cost. So there's a distorting factor that maybe doesn't make things as focused on cost-efficient investment as they could or should be.
One other clarifying question, and I see a question that I think is good for both of these, but the clarifying question, have costs of student support been considered or only teacher support in these programs, Joe?
That's a really good question, and I think it's more an artifact of the programs we looked at, and it'd be interesting to unpack what we mean by student support. So like if there are additional investments in, say, school feeding, and there are a lot of different ways we can interpret what is meant by that. So the programs we looked at didn't necessarily have those kinds of additional components that maybe one could characterize as student support. And what we were also focused on was what was happening instructionally and what were the contributions to improving instruction. So what goes on in classrooms primarily. Some of the programs did have like a community engagements element, as often a lot of projects do. And so those did factor into the costs, and to the extent to which they were seen as critical to contributing to what was happening in school.
As Room to Read is one of the programs under this study, I can just speak for that particular one in India. The student level things would be like a textbook for students or books that they're accessing in libraries, but that program itself does not have scholarships for individual students. But it's, I think, a good question that leads to figuring out what goes into these equations and how we categorize things is often up for debate, and often different folks think about these things differently. Where one person would think about a student's textbook as student level support, another is thinking about it as a support for teacher to have the learning materials that they need in their classroom.
Yeah, I see another comment there from Suzanne that I want to speak to, and that is exactly the point I was trying to make, Suzanne, to sort of separate out. So when we looked more closely at the one example of the $4.04 unit cost, to really just look at the elements that were related to the direct investments in what goes on in classrooms, so the teacher training, the teacher support, et cetera. And so that's where we can begin to isolate from the overall project costs, which often there's a significant cost of it just being a project, right? Having an office, having staff. And so even if we think those investments are needed to move off of the status quo ante in terms of the functioning of the system, we know those aren't recurring costs that need to be continued, right? So that and I think Chantale made this point of switching from what investments you need to make to then what the ministry needs to carry forward. And so that's the analysis that I tried to show at the end of the presentation there as costs. You get over that initial hump of investment and then think about what's the sort of continued level of spending that the system needs to make to keep functioning at a higher level of performance.
Thanks. Whitney has a good question, I think, for, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, if you allow me, a colleague of mine have a question from Joe. First of all, I want to say it's a very interesting presentation, and I liked, like, we're still a few years before you in our scaling journey, and it's nice to see also the journey you've been through and the cost and the numbers that has been associated. And it would be great also, I'd be in touch for further discussions if possible. A colleague of mine has a question for Joe, if that's possible. Can she ask it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry for intruding. I was listening to the very interesting conversation. My name is Hiba Fode. I used to work with the Jordan Ahlan Simsim program as a scaling and learning manager. So this stuff is still very intriguing and very close to heart. So Joe, as you were mentioning, as you were showing that kind of trajectory in the change of costs over the years, having worked with different ministries, we know sometimes that, and us as a sector, as an INGO sector, we set this kind of expectation of more money means more commitment. And as that kind of funding goes down based on needs and costs, does that, from your experience, affect kind of the partnership aspect of it or managing the relationship? Given that at the beginning you set a precedence of a high amount and then it goes down, do you see a shift in commitment or pushing forward the intervention or scaling it up as the amount goes from 9 million to almost 1 million? And the second question is, even as it goes down to 1 million, and you mentioned this, many education systems do not have that amount. What would be what the sustainability plan would be for that? Is it constantly having some source of donor funding, INGO funding, or is there another strategy once you get to that point of getting to that cost efficiency of exploring other financing sources or models? And thank you for allowing me to ask these two questions.
Joe, you're on mute.
That's great, and that's like such a core issue, right? That really is behind everything we're talking about. So a couple of things. And one, the part of the agreement, if you will, sort of at a global scale between international development and education systems that are needed support is that there will be an infusion of resources that will help improve what's currently being done, right? So that's part of the agreement. So that has to happen, right? Because the system is, in most countries, are functioning at a certain level with the resources that they have available and the amount of learning that they're able to produce given that. So an infusion of resources is needed to try and move off of that. And so, I mean, that's the whole purpose of international assistance, right? But then the question is, what are our assumptions about how that is maintained and how what needs to be maintained is still going to be different than what was being spent before. And I think analytically, right, from sort of a geek perspective, trying to understand exactly what we're talking about there in terms of those additional costs that are needed beyond the initial infusion. So that's some analysis that I think as a field, we should be looking to do more systematically. And maybe others on the call who are doing this kind of work can speak to that. But even in some countries, it becomes a question of when they can take that over, right? And sort of, so I like to say in some circles that sustainability in some instances is a lie, right? To pretend that we'll come in for 5 years, we'll be done, you'll sustain it so long, thanks, good luck with that, right? And so challenging ourselves to be more realistic about that and accepting that there'll need to be some continued support. And even in a place like Jordan, it may not be coming in the form of a project, but there are other forms of government to government assistance that, helps sustain the budget, the overall budget of the government in Jordan. So those, I think, are some really interesting questions, and I'll stop talking there so others have a chance to jump in.
Thanks, Joe. There was a question on what tools are available to do these types of cost analyses. And Chantale, I know that the IRC has done quite a fair number of work, especially on their emergency response type of interventions, which we have found really useful to help Room to Read sort of progress in our thinking around cost analysis. So Chantale, I don't know if you have some thoughts on what tools might be available, and similarly with Joe on this study or others that RTI have been doing. How do we figure out what those equations are and what tools are going to help us figure out what is legitimate project-based costs, but that's the cost of starting a project, legitimate costs to do the development of the intervention, the upstart costs, and then the recurring costs might be maintenance costs, they might be new infusions over time. So what tools are there to help this community?
So for the IRC, we have put a lot of efforts in doing that, and we have a team that's called Best Use of Resources, and this team works closely with everyone else to be able to assess this. For Ahlan Simsim per se, what we have done is we've adapted some of the tools that exist, and we've developed what's called resourcing tool. that would help us track every single detail. Like sometimes it's too detailed, and this is what we get from the team, but does help to start like from that moment so that we think of every single cost at the beginning. And as Joe said, and as we've seen already, is that it's not one tool for one time you do it for scaling. You have to do it when you start, you have to do it in the middle when things get a bit challenging. For all of us work in scaling, we know that the middle phase is very challenging, and then you take it forward also and do it when it's going into expansion and then scale. How do we do this tool at different steps and be able to align it, taking into consideration that the economic situation in the world has changed drastically in the last couple of years. So we have to also look at what fitted or what costed $1 a few years ago would cost even more now. So these are all taken into consideration in the analysis.
Joe, you're on mute.
I'll come off of mute and try to speak to that. And then I think Christine, who we worked with on the Learning at Scale study, can maybe chime in as well. But one of the things, and I can give an example from the work we've been doing in Cambodia. And this is pretty typical, is to develop like a costing projection model, right? Like based on in which years, how many schools will you extend the program to, et cetera, but to make it so that you can vary key parameters like the unit costs of the materials, the amount of materials that will be provided, the amount of training, the amount of training days, et cetera. And so by using that, a tool like that in Cambodia, it helped address a really specific challenge, two challenges actually. So the initial program that was a pilot had, part of the infusion of resources was project provided coaches to support teachers at the school level, right? So to make up for a deficiency in the system, that there weren't people able to visit schools and provide coaching and support to teachers. But by looking at the scale projection model and realizing that that was inherently unsustainable at scale. And so it helped have the conversation with the ministry about what are alternative ways to, within the structure of the system, to create that role of ongoing teacher support. And that's the current model that is being taken to scale in Cambodia. So that's a tool that can help you model different the impact of different cost parameters on the projections of those recurring costs as you increase the level of implementation of a program as it progresses towards scale. I don't know if Christine wanted to jump in, but go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, I was just reading Christine's note. Somebody has shared, let's see who, someone shared Dioptra as a tool, and there's a link in the chat. And then Christine also shared a link in the chat to some of the tools that USAID has been sharing as well on cost measurement tools. Thank you, both of you. And then June Lee has also shared some links to Brookings has a tool for ECD. So there's a link in the chat for that as well. There was an interesting question. There's lots of interesting questions. We can go on for this for many hours. We only have a few minutes. Somebody was asking Chantale, as you reflected on the meetings with governments, how did those discussions influence what elements of the program would be scaled, and how do you think about cost when you're in those discussions?
So as I said at the beginning, it's all about a co-creation of an intervention together. So it's all about finding the right fit, not the right two components that can sit next to each other, so that it can be taken, if sustainability is now met, it can be taken forward by the teams and by the national parties in the future. So the question is, that was very special, and I've seen that question of why is it different across different countries, because the needs are different. Like we've seen Jordan going into development while the education system, for example, now in Lebanon is suffering. So we're seeing like these two different contexts, as at the same time we've seen a very heavy curriculum for ECE in Iraq that needs an integration of a new approach, not on the content itself, but either a new approach to teach. So it all depends on what is the exact need of the ministry we're working with. And we provide an array of what we call offerings in a way that could be adaptable to the system, that should be and are adaptable and scalable to the system. So, and also the question from the beginning that we ask our partners and we have a discussion with them, have you tried something similar before? Why isn't not in the system anymore? And if costing is the reason, so we don't invest in the same way because we want to avoid that. I'm not saying definitely there's a cost we endure at the beginning, either printing or training or refurbishing of classrooms, because this is the main cost you put at the beginning to get the work flowing, as long as the system can take it forward in the future.
Thanks, Chantale. And we have a question here. Do we have enough data yet to determine the cost sweet spots, or lack of a better term?
I don't know if that question is answerable in sort of like at a global scale, right?
Yeah.
If we were to think of, you know, and we'd have to subdivide it. So Chantale, you could maybe speak to early childhood, but like say the stuff we've been focusing on a lot and the learning at scale research that are focusing on a lot was the teaching of early grade reading, right? Improvements of that. So I think we have a good understanding of the ingredients that are needed, and the learning at scale study is really pointing to some important learnings around that in terms of how to get, not just have the materials, have the improved curriculum, improved materials, improve instructional approaches, but how to get teachers to actually adopt those approaches, et cetera. So I think that gives us the set of ingredients. Now, what that costs to do in Kenya versus India versus Cambodia, I don't know if we could standardize that or if we want to, right?
Thanks, Joe. Chantale, any final thoughts you want to share? We're going to wrap up.
I believe at the end, like, costing is something that we have been all looking into to better understand, and it's an effort that learning from each other has been very interesting and a great step forward. I think also from today, there's a lot of learning to take forward together, at least from our side as Ahlan Simsim, also with Joe and some of the team who are here. It's a long journey, but if we can make a difference. I was in a conference last week, and the impact of COVID and the economic situation on children is growing, and financing is one of the #1 questions. So as long as we keep these questions, be able to provide data and think of return on investment that we can prove to lobby and advocacy for more investments that are coming from the national system into education, we can make a big change beyond every single project we're working on. So I think sometimes we try to avoid this question because it's complicated, but having this webinar and having these opportunities and cross-learning, like, really says, even if we're coming in with questions rather than answers, that's a good start. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Joe and Chantale. I do think we don't have yet enough cost analysis data out there in research, so I do encourage all of us to continue this and recognize that there are legitimate overhead costs. There are legitimate costs to our organizations being able to do the work we do. And those costs don't necessarily have to make us scared to talk about costs of the interventions. We can continue figuring out how to identify those costs that need to get scaled, that need to get integrated, and tease that apart a little bit from the overhead discussion and salaries and all of this stuff that gets a little prickly and a little proprietary and all of that. But I encourage us to continue finding those areas where we can come together and share data and share information on this. With that, we are wrapping up today. We are going to do our next webinar in September, and we have some ideas on some of the topics. Also want to ask ideas from all of you for topics that you'd like. Right now, some of our ideas are trade-offs between equity, effectiveness, sustainability, and reach. Another one is the role of intermediary organizations, and another is teacher training support. And again, I encourage you to either drop it in the chat if you have an idea right now, or reach out to Simone and I with your ideas. We're more than happy to figure out what makes most sense for this group. And Simone, I don't know if you have any final thoughts you want to share.
Thank you so much, Heather. I saw that Johannes had his hand up. I don't know if he
sorry.
It's okay. If he still has a comment. Johannes?
Thank you. No, I really appreciate. I couldn't put my comment in for some reason the chat box. So let me, maybe it's not a bad way to close. So first of all, I want to thank you, Simone, for starting with the principles, because that really set the stage, I think, and links for me and for us more generally in the community practice, I think links back to, in a sense, where we all have some common ground. So thank you. Second, I think for Joe, where there are multiple stages in the scaling, presumably your hump in costs will continue over time. So there's sort of multiple. So it isn't just one-off. In many situations, you have those non-recurring costs actually recurring over, say, 10 to 15 years. And so you really have to plan for the longer term. At the same time, I think your focus on sustainability costs is absolutely critical. And from my experience, say in the infrastructure sector, we tend to neglect that, just as you do in the education sector. And by the way, we know from evaluations of multilateral donor funding projects that sustainability is the weakest element of all the projects, and it's precisely because O&M costs and sustainability costs aren't factored in the project design and implementation beyond the project end. And so I think your point has general relevance. Finally, I wonder whether we need to pay attention to the private cost of public service provision. In education, it's traditionally, the school uniforms, which I recall. But in every public service area, do we have private costs, which we often don't adequately consider? And that, of course, affects the demand for the services very often, and the actually adoption of services. So I'm just flagging that when we look at costs, let's not look only at budgetary and public costs, but let's look also at private costs. And I thank you for the extra time. Over.
Thank you. And thank you, Gael. Sorry I kept calling you Simone, but thank you, Gael.
Gael, right.
No worries. Thank you so much, Johannes. This was actually a very perfect way of closing the session for us. And thank you, everybody, for your engagement and for the extra minute or two. I know there's a lot of questions about the costing tools. So I think Heather and I can sit together and discuss whether or not it would make sense to have a follow-up webinar where we're really focusing on the tools. And Christine wanted to talk more about it. Christine, we would love to have you as a panelist. So we'll be in touch very soon with anybody. And if you do have a tool, you want to share it, you would love to participate in another webinar on this topic, we'll be in touch. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day or good evening. We'll see you all soon.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.